And now I've shown you a little bit data just so that it will be a talk. And now I want to talk to you about how do we arrive at the conclusions we desire. Okay? And we arrive at these conclusions by thinking, because this is how we reason about the world. And thinking relies on abstraction. And abstraction is a process of omitting what we judge to be less relevant in a specific context. Okay, this is what my PhD was about, and what I worked a lot about with Nira and Yankele. We reason by abstraction. Abstraction involves neglecting some aspects of reality. And it's really evidenced by neglecting inconvenient realities, we can get where we want. Okay, when we paint this picture, this more abstract representation of reality, we can omit the blemishes that we have. Sorry. Listen, so we'll have questions at the end. I'll really try to be effective. I'm 7 minutes late. So. Listen, and it's so clear that whatever you think of this conflict, if it's simple to you, you have to neglect something, right? You can say, yeah, Israel is killing tens of thousands of people, and then someone else says, yeah, you're neglecting the fact that Hamas started this war, it's not yielding, not releasing the hostages. And someone else will say, you're neglecting the fact that Palestinians are under occupation, they had to do something. And then someone else will say, you're neglecting the fact that they were offered a country, they didn't have to be under occupation. Someone else will say, but this offer wasn't fair, wasn't a real country, etc. We can go on, and each person's narrative would be a neglect of something, some aspect of it, right? I'm not saying something that you didn't notice yourself right now. I'm just trying to highlight how important this neglect is, how important this, you can never have a full picture of reality. Reality is infinite dimensional, but this can go, if you want it to be simple, you have to neglect a lot of stuff. This is abstraction. And finding what information, this is a very general thing, finding what information or what aspects of reality, it's not necessarily information, is neglected from our construal can help us identify important biases in our thinking. And many of the successes of social psychology really can be described as neglect in construal. When you think of the base rate neglect, okay, it's called neglect. When you think of probability neglect, people's tendency sometimes to not think accurately about probabilities or disregard them. When you think about confirmation bias in motivated reasoning, oftentimes one of the mechanisms, the main one is the neglect of contrary evidence. When you think of the fundamental attribution error in social psychology, is everybody on the same page? The tendency of people to ignore the situation and attribute behaviors to some inherent properties of the actor. You can think of this as some sort of a neglect of the situation. Okay, we're neglecting something, we're abstracting something. We can think of naive realism, bias blind spot, our inability to construe our own subjectivity as important to our judgments as the neglect of our subjectivity, of our own lens. Temporal discounting, planning fallacy. We're neglecting the future. We're myopic about the future. We're thinking about the now, not putting into this picture our set of things we construe. And phenomena like dehumanization, infrahumanization, all of these we're neglects of empathy. We're neglecting maybe not information, but some aspect of reality that other people are human, that you are human. So thinking of social psychology and classic biases through the lens of neglect is a little bit abstract, but could be informative for us to think how important is this concept of construal neglect, motivated neglect in our reasoning about consequential things. And I'm going to discuss in the talk that will start now general aspects of life that people neglect in their construal of this specific war. Okay, and we're going to talk about what emerges from thinking specifically about this horrible situation. And this is very context specific and very, political and very, but what I noticed thinking about this is that some general things sort of emerge. Some sort of, by looking at the discourse concerning such a horrible situation, we can find what are the things that are a little bit more consequential than other things. What are the biases that are more consequential, I think. Okay? So this is the setup for the talk. So far, are you with me in terms of where I want to go? And I'm going to talk about the following sort of neglects that I see. Again, I might be wrong. Okay? I see some neglects in our construals of the war of paradoxical effects that might occur from our actions. We sometimes neglect some remote costs associated with the war. We neglect analogy errors, and we neglect something that I call the existential condition neglect, some expansion of the fundamental attribution bias. I'm going to talk about all of these things. Some of these are old biases and neglects in a new name. I want to, before I go into this again, I want to emphasize I'm talking about people's construals of the war, not about the war itself. The people's construals of the war may not matter at all. There is a real war going on. There is a real horror going on. We're talking about something that might not matter, but it's still what we do as psychologists. Okay? Can we? Sorry. Paradoxical effects neglect. Maybe. So listen, in goal attainment, often what we get is monotonous. If we expand effort, if there's reason to believe that some X would lead to some Y, then doing more of X often gives more of Y. If I want to be healthy, if I exercise more, I'll be more healthy, right? If I want more crops, I invest more, I plant more seeds, I get more crops. Are you with me on this, right? Sometimes monotonous relations don't hold. I won't surprise you that there are phenomena like over-exercising. Sometimes protecting your children can lead to them being fragile, too fragile. Sometimes if you increase government spending, you cause inflation and then you reduce the value of money. Sometimes if you're tolerant of everything, society becomes intolerant. Sometimes if you increase the price of a product, people won't buy it. Sometimes you use military force trying to defeat an enemy and you create an enemy. Okay, sometimes these paradoxical effects happen. I'm not saying something that you didn't think about, right? But I think that sometimes it's people systematically neglect the possibility of non-monotonous relation between effort and outcome. You type relationships. Habitual behavior. People who do some work in reinforcement learning, study this. You have your habitual response, but sometimes in this two-step task, I won't go into that much, but you might know this from your research. The habitual response, the thing that is an act itself, can lead to a paradoxical effect, and you need some sort of model of the world, a model-based strategic reasoning to understand that by pressing on this button, I would actually get to this planet, will get me a worse result, and it's not that easy, okay? And for children and for people with lower attention, sometimes it's easier for us to go with the direct cause and effect that we habitually saw. When we express our desires, in many intersubjective situations, expressing your desire leads to attaining them. I want a pay raise. I go to my boss and say, listen, I deserve a pay raise, you get it. In a democracy, you say, I want a different policy, I want to lower taxes. You go and you demonstrate, and it often works. This is what democracy is all about, right? But sometimes it doesn't work. If I want Tali to love me, I can't demand this from her. I need to, okay, I can't tell you, Tali, love me, you have to love me, you have to love me.
He's trying.
Yes, it's not working. In warfare, obviously, telling that I want to kill you, I want to conquer this area, it's not going to happen by you saying it. But our public discourse is dominated by the frame of democracy. I want something, I ask for it. And it often works. It's often effective. And here I have some criticism. Did the Western calls for a ceasefire promote a ceasefire? Israel is unlikely to cease fire without a hostage. These are my perspectives, my opinion, I might be wrong. Okay, I apologize. I think that Israel will require the hostages to cease its fire, and the hostage deal will require some sort of agreement between Hamas and Israel. And ceasefire calls are made towards Western governments, if they're meant towards the Western governments, asking these Western governments to put pressure on Israel. It has perhaps positive effect if Israel really is the only, but we can't neglect the fact that they also could have a paradoxical effect. You've probably thought of this, and maybe you don't think this is such a big deal, but the global process signaled to Hamas that Israel is pressured to stop, and as such may have had some ironic effects on the sense for a ceasefire. Okay, I'm not saying this is the whole story, but and I'm sure that many people who went and protested thought of this and said, yeah, there could be this effect and there could be that effect, and this is my model of the world. Are you with me? Yeah? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe these the effects of protests in Western capital is monotonous and bringing the chances of a ceasefire higher. Okay, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is some sort of cognitive difficulty or infrequency of these non-monotonous relations that causes us to not think about this. We don't think about the fact that I'm demonstrating in a Western country. It will put pressure on Israel, but both sides have, okay? And maybe there's something specific, but I think that this is an example of something a little bit more general. That in the context that we have this tendency, this habit of expressing our desires, believing that their expression would bring about the desired results in a monotonous manner, and we sometimes perhaps not think about the possibility of paradoxical effects. Maybe I'm wrong. We should ask ourselves this, okay? If I'm wrong or not, I think that this I agree with. I agree with myself. We should ask ourselves whether there are potential paradoxical effects in our actions, and whether our actions could be the results of neurotic rather than existential compassion. You know, Buber talked about existential and neurotic guilt. Existential, okay? We can feel guilty out of focusing on the self, or we can feel guilty in a way that will drive change. And we should be, as Buber spoke about this in the context of altruism, we should keep that in mind in the context of guilt. We should think about this in the context of altruism. Am I thinking outwards or inwards? Am I neglecting the potential paradoxical effects of my actions because I'm engaged in a habit? This is what I do. Things get bad, I protest. Okay, we need to ask ourselves. The answer would be whatever it would be, but I agree with myself that we need to ask this. Am I neglecting the potential paradoxical effects of my actions because I'm actually looking inward, establishing a sense of significant self, expressing my attitudes? Okay, we know that this is part of the story, and we can be cynical about it. We don't have to be. We have to be conscious of it. This is the only thing that I'm asking people. Okay, be conscious. Whatever political goal we're trying to what extent have I thought this through, and whether I consider the possibility that I'm behaving in a neurotic rather than existential mode. Okay, are you with me? Not with me on my claims, but in terms of attention. Okay, you can and we can and I hope to leave time to rebut me. So I know Eran wants to. You have something. Yeah. Okay.
We might neglect the paradoxical effects to both sides.
For sure.
For going out is one thing, and for staying home.
Definitely. Yeah. I'm neglecting this. Okay. Yeah. But do you understand the question that I want to pose? Whether yeah. Okay. I want to talk now about the potential that we're neglecting remote costs. Costs are sometimes neglected in general. We have social psychology to show this, that people underestimate the efforts that they needed to carry out their plans, okay, the planning policy. People are sometimes myopic towards risk, especially when they are uncertain or lie in the future, right? The risk from unhealthy habits, from climate change, you're myopic sometimes. Sometimes when costs are explicitly described, people are actually very responsive to costs. Okay, this is prospect theory. People can be very loss averse, right? They can be very responsive to this notion of a cost and say, I would avoid this cost, and even if it's sometimes diminishing my utility. We can be aware of costs, okay? When decisions are construed as psychologically distant, research on construal level theory, my former advisor, says that we tend to focus on the central rather than the peripheral aspects of the choice. what choice we have in a given situation. We will focus on something that is central. What is considered central, the abstract features versus the concrete features, changes across people, across situations. It's not objectively defined, but often in the case of gambles, in the case of a situation we can gain something and you can lose something, this causes people to be risky, to focus on the gains. And this is a finding that is strong and predates psychology even, comes from finance. The riskiness of a racetrack wagers declines as the post-time approaches. People think that when the risk is far, they will gain it. They won't. We can mitigate the risk somehow. People are focused on the gains and discount the risks when gambles are far. And we see this in many contexts. And it's horrible, but we are in a horrible gamble, Israel. We can't really read this. Israel, the world, is in a horrible gamble. We're gambling on people's lives here. The hostage lives, the lives of Palestinians, lives of soldiers. There's no way out of this gamble. This I'm sure that everybody is keenly aware of, right? There is some sort of... And I think that when somebody says we have to defeat Hamas now and not worry about the hostages, then they're neglecting what it means, right? They're neglecting the death of innocent Palestinians and neglecting the death of the hostages. They're not saying, I will kill, the hostages will die, no Palestinians will... It's out of the discourse, okay? Forget for a second whether it's in the head. It's out of the discourse of the people who want to focus on winning the war now. And when we say about we have to release the hostages now, which is where I stand, okay? I am neglecting the costs when I'm talking about it. There are costs that the victorious Hamas will destabilize the West Bank. There are costs that the chance of the future peace in this area will decrease. There are costs, I think, that Hamas will gain. There are costs, okay? And we can, and even on the interim possibilities, we release the hostages now and then we defeat Hamas. I think this is the standard position of the left. We can do that. We have to neglect the fact that Hamas is not willing to give us what we want. We want the release of the hostages in a very protracted manner across years. We will have to. There is a cost. There will be a cost, most likely, I think. Again, maybe I'm wrong. I'm not a geopolitical expert, okay? I'm just... if we let the war drag on, people are suffering. It's not that there are costs, okay? I'm not saying something that you haven't thought of, okay? What I want us to think about is that how much distance the situation affords us. The situation of this horrible gamble that the world, the Palestinians, that Israel has found themselves in. We're talking about policy that is at the nation level. They are more likely perceived as more distant than your financial decisions that you make. There's the man who's making this decision. It's not you. Okay, it's some distant entity. If you're a citizen of the United States or the citizens of UK rather than a citizen of Gaza, then this is something that is more distant to you, and you don't have to, the costs are, everything is distant. If you're parochial, or even if not, you might care less about the hostages, you might care... It's easy, you have so much distance to work with. The outcomes, they're in the outcomes of the deal, let's say, are in the far future. They're uncertain. Maybe it won't happen. Maybe it will be fine. It's easy to feel this distant from whatever we anticipate. Do you understand this point? You don't have to agree, but... And again, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe in some of these situations, there aren't the costs that I imagined them to be. Maybe I'm just, okay. Maybe people are aware well of these costs, and are willing to pay them with, okay, or at least some people. Maybe some people don't even see them as costs. Maybe they're so parochial that they don't give, a fuck about other people's lives, okay? Maybe in some situations, people don't see this as but a lot of people, I think, are in a really impossible situation. It's not their choice, but somebody else has to make a choice, and we have to orient ourselves towards some, and we're torn. And this, when we are torn, we feel dissonance, right? We feel conflict. Tali, you study it, and a lot of people here. We should ask ourselves, to the very least, okay, am I somewhat neglecting some of the cost of my desired policy so that I will not have to feel the dissonance that comes with this conflict, this sort of tension, this sort of real horrible feeling that we will feel if we approach the fact that, yeah, I've decided to sacrifice human beings, I've decided to sacrifice other human beings, I've decided to risk the chance of peace, to risk the chance of all of these things. Have I let myself off the hook? And this is a question to ourselves, okay? Am I letting myself off the hook? Maybe we have to. Maybe there's no other way, okay? But I want to raise this point as well, that we're sometimes neglecting perhaps remote costs to avoid the sense of cognitive dissonance, and perhaps we should ask ourselves, to what extent are we motivated by emotion, okay? Are you neurotic emotions? So far, are you following me? Am I speaking too quickly? Okay. I want to talk about analogy or error. We have to end at
15 minutes.
15 minutes.
And then 10 minutes for questions.
Okay.
Discussion.
Our narratives of this current event, not just these current events, really rely on narratives that rely on analogy. Is Israel a settler colonial state? Is Israel the United States after 9/11? Is Hamas ISIS or the Nazis? And all of these analogies work to a certain extent. There is always an analogical mapping you can make between a target domain and source domain. Not always, oftentimes. Israel is like European colonialists in the sense that many Israelis came from Europe, Palestinians are under occupation. There are similarities to the colonial situation, but there are also differences. Jews were somewhat indigenous to Israel, we escaped European persecution. It's never perfect, okay? Hamas is like the Nazis. Hamas wishes to kill or expel the Jews, like the Nazis, but it's not as powerful. It draws on a protracted bloody conflict. Okay. Israel responses like America post 9/11. Yeah, there was a horrible terrorist attack, and Israel responded by killing tens of thousands, just like the United States. But you can say maybe it's not the same thing. The consequences of military inaction are different. Right now there are hostages. Okay, what do you do with them? Okay, it's not the perfect analogy. It's never the perfect analogy. I'm not sending you anything you don't know, right? Analogies are never perfect. So what? This is the nature of abstraction. When it comes to stereotypes, social psychology has told us stereotypes may work as mental shortcuts, they may work as a way to reason, but we have to be vigilant about overgeneralization. There are epistemic costs, there are human costs, okay? When we have a keen appreciation of the limits of analogy, of abstraction in certain situations. In the case of stereotypes, this is one of them. We know that we lose a lot. It seems to me that the social psychological attempts to enlighten human reasoning and discourse, Tversky and Kahneman, whoever walked this domain, have not really provided us yet with tools to critically assess our neglects of these analogies. These analogies are really important in our construal of reality, in the maintenance of narratives, including very destructive or helpful narratives, and we let them off the hook, I feel. This is here I'm talking to the field. This type of neglect seems to be really central in motivating these grand narratives. I'm not saying that all grand narratives are wrong and we should neglect all of them, but we should be keenly aware of the costs, okay? Not much research. I've really delved into the literature trying to see what sort of nuance is there to our understanding of how people use analogies in motivated reasoning. Very little. I found this research from a law journal, showing that if you get a jurist's opinion on a certain situation, ideologically driven, people will adopt the precedents in cases that fit their desired outcome. So each cases in law are often based on precedent. Is this like this previous case? There's lots of wiggle room. You can p-hack your way into this as much as you want. how sensitive are we to the error that our analogies create? How much effort has been trying to understand when to allow people to better reason about these analogies and assess their appropriateness. This is just me bashing social psychology, okay? And I think that we should ask ourselves, whenever we adopt this narrative, this is anti-Semitism all over again, raising its hand like in the Nazis, or this is like 9/11, whenever we use these literary devices, these analogical mappings, we should ask ourselves, what are we getting out of it? Yes, we're getting out of this some understanding that we get from theory, for sure. But do they create some sort of sense of epistemic coherence, relief? Do all the pieces fit miraculously together suddenly? Do I have suddenly a sense of, now I get it? If I do, I should be suspicious. I agree with myself here that we should ask this of ourselves, and when this happens, we should be very suspicious of ourselves. Okay? This is a claim. Lastly, and I'm doing fine on time, I will let you, you're still with me in terms of attention, not in terms of, okay. Existential condition neglect. What to do with the guilt, the blame, you can say it doesn't matter, you can say it matters immensely. But I've seen all sorts of opinions saying that Hamas owns every death in Gaza. Okay? They started this war, they're hiding behind suggestions. No moral responsibility to the other party. I've seen other takes saying that Israel is committing genocide without any relation to the war, to the hostages. It was want to kill everybody. Okay, two takes on the same situation. One denying any sort of responsibility from Israel. The other attributing every ounce of responsibility just to Israel's actions. Okay. And the answer is never always just the middle. I'm not, Ran, I'm reading your book. I'm not, and it's not that we should be moderate, but we should keep in mind the notion of bad faith. It's in existential philosophy has been influential in Simone de Beauvoir, in Sartre. The idea is that the human condition, really, if you take the existential point of view into consideration, is characterized by two things. Something the Sartre calls facticity. Like all objects, all animals, we are limited by the facts of reality. We're not gods. We don't think something and it happens. We have constraints. This is true, right? Another thing that is also true to a certain extent is that we have, or we think we have, or we live as if we have free will. Okay? We have choices. We have something they call potentiality or transcendence. We have the capacity to choose otherwise. It's not that our actions are fully determined by the constraints of our reality. Okay? And the existentialists call this notion of bad faith as denying each of these aspects. If you deny the fact that you have as a human have some freedom of choice, some alternative, some capacity for alternative, some responsibility of finding an alternative, you're denying your humanness. If you're denying the fact that you're not omnipotent, that you can just do anything, you're also denying your humanness. You're also denying the fact that you have to live, okay? And doing that, according to them, is a huge categorical error in the way we should think about the world and our responsibility in the world, okay? Where is psychology here? Listen, a key lesson from social psychology is in our analysis of human facticity, what they call the constraints. This is the classic social psychology, the Milgram experiment, okay, the Zimbardo. We documented the strong effects of the facticity, the situation. People are not fully free. We're not good or bad fully. The situation matters. We documented this in a convincing manner, and it meant a lot, I think, for society. For these things are taught everywhere, and people probably should have understood more about the limits of human choice by looking at this. We talked about the fundamental attribution error. people do tend to neglect the importance of these situational constraints. Okay, the classic study is the one where participants were told you have to write a pro-Castro or anti-Castro essay, right? And then other participants were given these essays, and in one condition they were told, this person was told to write a pro-Castro essay. And they neglected that. They still thought this person likes Castro. They neglect the fact that this person had constraints on them. It wasn't fully free in the situation, okay? And this is the fundamental attribution error. It's considered one of the best things we've provided to the world, to thinking, to discourse. People aren't fully free. We should acknowledge this in our corrective systems, in our geopolitical thinking. We shouldn't demonize people. We should think of situations important. Are you so far? And we should apply to a certain extent this lesson, I think, opinion, here as well. It seems to me that both pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian individuals are overestimating the degree of freedom that Palestinians and Israelis have. We're not omnipotent. To the very least, compared to American foreign policy, compared to Russians, Israelis and Palestinians have limited freedom. We are in a death grip with each other, and sometimes, I don't know if this is the case, I hope this is not the case, your facticity, I don't think it is the case, your facticity, your situation is simply tragic, okay? In such a situation, or to the extent that such a situation is just tragic, a key social psychological insight is that if we neglect the power of the situation, we're less likely to improve the situation. If we blame, if we demonize, we will miss the opportunities to understand you are in a tough spot right now as a Palestinian, as an Israeli. You're not a demon. How do I analyze your situation in a way that finds the potentialities for you and for another person to behave in a way that is better for everyone? Okay, if we just ignore the situation, we are less prone to find answers sometimes. Okay, this is a key insight from social psychology. But we also can't neglect the potentiality. There's danger of construing the war just in terms of the facticity, the denial of potentiality. How true is it that Gazans had no alternative to targeting civilians on the 7th of October? Is there no option for pursue non-violent resistance, political? How true is it that Israelis has no way to defend Palestinian civilians in pursuing the war? Maybe if we had maybe some more targeted military operation, evacuation of citizens, I don't know, something, okay? I don't know. I truly don't know. I truly don't know, okay? I'm not an expert on these things. Maybe the answer to one or both of these questions is negative. And the tragic facticity is unavoidable. I hope and I guess that it's not unavoidable. But regardless of what I think, any reasoning and discussion of this war and other situations cannot neglect the potential existence of alternatives. You can't neglect the potential to act differently. If you just fall into this position where the facticity is everything, okay? And the best way to identify such potentialities is not to ignore the facticities, to ignore that, yeah, there is a siege on Gaza. How can people live like this? There are hostages. What can people do? Hamas wants to kill Israelis. What can you do? You can't, right? If the discourse and your reasoning adopts an all or nothing sort of mindset concerning this question, you are in a tough spot of ever solving this, I think. This is not and the thing that I agree with, whether you that when I adopt a position, a moral position, a policy position, I should ask myself, am I denying either the facticity and the potentiality of human existence? Am I doing this in order to avoid some really daunting thing that is there, that the nature of human responsibility? There is some unavoidable tragedy, and there is some unavoidable necessary heroism that has immense cost as well. This is a tough spot to be in as a human, okay? Erich Fromm, for example, was one of the psychologists that talked about how we try to escape this precarious situation, how we try to escape this sense of existential freedom. It doesn't always feel that it's responsibility, okay? So I don't know whether my analysis of the situation is as it is, but I do agree with myself that this is something we should ask ourselves, okay? And now I've been fine in terms of time.
Yeah.
I'll just recap. I've talked about people's difficulty of reasoning in a non-motivated, a nuanced, deliberative way when death is at bay. I've talked about paradoxical effects, neglect. We should ask how my actions can produce the exact opposite of what I wish to attain, and ask whether I'm acting out of habits or towards identity goals. We should ask ourselves this. Talked about potential remote cost neglect. Ask myself in every situation, not just in the war, how would I react if the supposed costs are much more tangible than I perceive them to be? Am I distancing myself to reduce some sense of dissonance and conflict? Analogy errors. What are the holes in my analogy, and whether I'm sticking to it because it makes everything fit together, it feels. And the existential condition neglect. Ask myself whether there are alternatives that can allow me to transcend these constraints, whether I'm escaping human responsibility because it feels bad sometimes to have such responsibility. So listen, I don't have the answers, and I apologize for bringing all of this baggage to you, but this is the talk that I could give right now. Okay, and I think that I agree with myself that asking these questions is a good thing to do, regardless of the situation or the okay.